5 men crossed a fence on a remote Montana mountain. They ignored the warnings. They laughed at the signs. They vandalized the land and threatened the woman who owned it. 72 hours later, they were gone. No bodies at first, no blood, just abandoned trucks and a silence that made search teams nervous. The woman who lived there had documentation, alibis, and a past nobody knew about. What happened in those mountains was never proven, but after that incident, no one ever crossed her fence again. From which city in the world are you watching this story unfold today? If you appreciate tales about quiet strength and the consequences of crossing someone who warned you clearly, please consider subscribing. This is a story about boundaries, respect, and what happens when people mistake silence for weakness. The drone footage swept over the Bitterroot Range at dawn, capturing ridge after ridge of granite peaks that looked like broken teeth against a pale winter sky. The wind was the only sound for miles. No roads visible from this height, no power lines cutting through the wilderness, no signs of human life except for a single dirt track that wound through the valley like a scar, ending at a modest cabin built into the hillside at the highest defensible point. The land stretched for 640 acres in every direction, raw and unforgiving country, the kind of place where nature made the rules and people were just passing through, the kind of place someone chose when they wanted to be forgotten. Thayer Ashford Grace had purchased this property 18 months ago. The realtor had been honest about the problems. Poachers had been using the land for years, treating it like their personal hunting ground. The previous owner, a retired Cold War intelligence officer named Colonel Harlan Drexel, had given up trying to enforce boundaries. Too isolated, he said, too much terrain, too few consequences. Thayer had listened to all of this without expression. She asked 3 questions. Are the property lines clearly marked? Is the title free of liens? Can I close in cash within 30 days? The realtor answered yes to all 3. Thayer signed the papers without negotiation. She paid $400,000 in cash, transferred from an account in Virginia Beach. She asked no questions about the previous owner beyond his contact information. She gave no explanation for why a woman in her mid-40s would want to live alone on a mountain 12 miles from the nearest neighbor. The property line was marked more clearly than most surveyed land in the county. Every 50 yards, a fence post stood with a metal sign bolted to it. Private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted. The signs were professional grade, weather-resistant, impossible to miss unless you were choosing not to see them. Trail cameras were mounted on trees at strategic intervals, their solar panels catching the morning light. The cabin itself sat at elevation, positioned with clear sight lines down the access road and across the open meadow that surrounded it on 3 sides. Anyone approaching would be visible long before they arrived. That was not an accident. Thayer walked her property line every morning. She moved with an economy of motion that suggested years of physical discipline. Tall and lean, her frame carried no excess weight. Her hands were calloused and scarred. The kind of wear that came from work and something harder to name. Something that left permanent marks. She checked each fence post, each sign, documenting everything in a weathered notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. When she found boot prints crossing the boundary line near the eastern ridge, she stopped. Her face showed nothing. She photographed the prints from multiple angles, using a digital camera with GPS coordinates embedded in each image. She measured the stride length with a tape measure. She noted the tread pattern, sketching it carefully in her notebook. Then she moved on. The locals called her that woman who bought the Drexel place. She drove into town once a month for supplies. She spoke to no one unless necessary. At the general store, she paid in cash, loaded her truck efficiently, and left without small talk. The cashier had tried asking where she was from. Thayer had replied with a polite smile and no information. After a few months, people stopped asking. She became another piece of the landscape. Noticed but not understood. Present but not participating. Her routine was precise. Morning coffee was made the same way every day. Water measured exactly, grounds weighed on a small digital scale that sat on the counter beside the French press. She did 30 pull-ups on a bar mounted in the doorframe. Her form was perfect, breathing controlled, shoulders engaged properly, no wasted movement. She ran the perimeter of her property, 5 miles of steep terrain, and returned barely winded. Firewood was chopped with textbook efficiency, each piece the same size, split with single strikes that spoke of practice and strength. The wood was stacked in geometrically perfect rows against the north wall of the cabin where it would stay dry. A hunting rifle hung above the fireplace. It was cleaned regularly, the action smooth, the barrel gleaming. Though she was never seen hunting, the maintenance was religious. Every Sunday morning the rifle came down, disassembled, cleaned, oiled, reassembled, like a ritual from another life. Topographical maps covered the table by lamplight in the evenings, elevations marked in pencil, sight lines calculated with a protractor and straight edge, notes in the margins in handwriting that was small and precise. Someone who had spent years recording information that mattered. The way she entered her own cabin revealed something most people would never notice. She cleared angles instinctively. Her hand moved to her hip where a sidearm would be carried, though she wore no weapon during the day. She slept on a cot positioned to see both the door and the window. Not the bed that came with the cabin. The bed sat unused, still made with the previous owner's blankets. A single photograph sat on the mantel above the fireplace. Face down, it had been there since she moved in, turned away from view as if looking at it cost something she could not afford to pay. The cabin was sparse but organized. Everything in its place, nothing unnecessary. It was the home of someone who had lived out of a rucksack for years and never quite adjusted to permanence. 3 weeks after she photographed the first boot prints, her trail cameras caught something that changed everything. 3 trucks rolled past a clearly posted no trespassing sign without slowing. Through the dusty windows, men with rifles were visible, laughing about something. The timestamp showed late afternoon. The GPS coordinates placed them 8 miles deep on her property, far beyond any reasonable claim of accident or confusion. Thayer sat in her cabin watching the footage on a laptop, her expression unchanging. She rewound the video, watched it again, froze the frame on a license plate, and zoomed in until the numbers were clear. Montana registration. She ran the plate through a database she should not have had access to. The results came back in seconds. Breck Holloway, age 43, 3 arrests for domestic violence. Charges dropped twice. Convicted once, sentence suspended. Current address in Kalispell. She ran the other 2 visible plates. Similar stories. Men with records. Men who had learned that certain behaviors carried no consequences if you were careful about where you committed them. Thayer opened a drawer. Inside was a satellite phone she had never used. It sat in its original packaging, the battery charged, the account active. She stared at it for a long moment. Her hand hovered over it, fingers twitching slightly. Then she closed the drawer without picking it up. Instead, she opened another notebook. This one was different from the documentation log. This one was filled with entries dating back months. Names, vehicle descriptions, patterns, timing. She had been watching them long before they knew she existed. At the bottom of the latest page, she wrote a single line in careful script. Day 83, first documented violation. Then she closed the notebook and returned to her maps. The hunting camp was professional. 5 men in their 30s to 50s had set up 8 miles inside Thayer's boundary line, far from any road, deep in terrain that required all-terrain vehicles to access. They had portable butchering stations, high-end rifles, expensive optics. These were not amateurs stumbling onto private land by mistake. The camp was organized, efficient, clearly the work of people who had done this many times before. They field-dressed in elk with practiced movements. No wasted motion, no hesitation. One of them tossed an empty beer can into the stream that ran past the camp. Another walked to one of Thayer's property markers and urinated directly on it, laughing as he did. The radio chatter was casual, dismissive. Breck, the leader, was in his early 40s, weathered and confident in the way men become when they have never faced real consequences. He mentioned the new signs on the fence line with amusement. Harlan, older and more cautious, asked if they should be concerned about the new owner. Breck laughed. Nobody was enforcing anything out here. Some city woman bought the land, he said. Probably never even comes up this far. Plays mountain hermit in that cabin. Cullen, the youngest at 30, was cocky. She probably does not even know we are here, he said. And even if she does, what can she do about it? Breck agreed with a grin. The sheriff was 3 hours away on good roads. Forest Service would not come up here for trespassing. They had been running these mountains for 15 years. Nobody had ever stopped them. Nobody ever would. The problem was not new. Cascade County had 2 deputies covering 2,400 square miles of mountainous terrain. Response time to Thayer's elevation was 4 to 6 hours, assuming the roads were passable and the weather cooperated. For a misdemeanor trespassing complaint, the priority was low. The previous owner, Colonel Drexel, had filed dozens of reports over the years. Nothing had changed. The poachers knew the mathematics. They understood the reality. Law enforcement was theoretical at this distance. Consequences were abstract. Boundaries were suggestions for people who chose to respect them. Thayer's cabin glowed with lamplight that night. She sat at the table reviewing maps. Red pins marked every location where trail cameras had caught trespassers. 17 pins. Each one represented a documented violation. Each one represented a choice to ignore clearly posted warnings. She opened the locked case she kept under the bed. Inside was equipment that did not belong in a civilian home. Night vision optics, military grade. A range-finding binocular that could calculate distance to within 1 meter at 1,500 yards. A tactical vest with a faded insignia, barely visible in the dim light. A seal trident, worn but unmistakable. Her hand hovered over the vest. She paused, motionless for several seconds. Her breathing slowed. Then she closed the case without removing anything. But she opened another drawer. The worn, moleskin notebook was different from the others. She flipped through pages of handwritten notes, names, vehicle descriptions, movement patterns, frequency of violations, behavioral observations. She had been watching them for months, learning their habits, counting how many times they ignored warnings before she acted. She turned to a fresh page and wrote in careful script, Day 83, pattern established, escalation anticipated. Then she set her watch alarm for 4 in the morning and sat in the dark, waiting for dawn. Over the next 6 weeks, the violations escalated exactly as she had predicted. The trail cameras caught the same trucks returning with increasing frequency, now with a 6th man. Equipment left scattered across the property. More trash, more deliberate damage. They were establishing permanence, claiming territory that was not theirs. Thayer posted new signs with explicit language. Active surveillance. All trespass documented. Law enforcement notified. Prosecution will be pursued to the fullest extent of the law. At the bottom of her notebook, she wrote, Day 121. Additional warnings posted. Escalation continues. The poachers' response was captured on video. One of them used the new sign for target practice, shooting it repeatedly while the others laughed. The footage showed them setting up a semi-permanent camp, building a fire pit, leaving gear stored in a makeshift shelter. They were not passing through anymore. They were claiming territory. Thayer made the drive into town, 45 minutes on rough roads that turned to mud when it rained. The sheriff's office was small, understaffed, overwhelmed by a county too large and too empty for adequate coverage. Deputy Freeman was in his late 20s, tired eyes suggesting too many shifts and not enough support. Thayer approached the counter and slid a folder across. Inside were printed photographs, license plate numbers, timestamps, GPS coordinates. Her voice was quiet and controlled when she spoke. 5 men have been on my property 43 times in 4 months. Names and addresses are in there. They are poaching. They are vandalizing. They have been warned repeatedly. Freeman glanced at the paperwork with the expression of someone who had seen this before and knew how it would end. He promised to add it to the report. Sheriff Tannick could probably send someone up next week when he was back from a training seminar in Billings. Thayer repeated the timeline carefully. Next week. Freeman looked uncomfortable. It was a big county, he said. Resources were stretched thin. He suggested carefully that maybe she should consider selling. That was rough country for someone alone. That property had always been trouble. He caught himself mid-sentence, realizing how it sounded. Thayer asked him to finish the thought. For what? Freeman backtracked. He just meant it was a lot of land to manage alone. Most people would find it overwhelming. The isolation, the distance from help. Thayer took her documentation back and turned to leave. Her voice was quiet when she spoke again. I will manage it. As she walked out, she passed a bulletin board covered in community notices. Among the flyers for yard sales and lost pets was a missing person poster. Gerald Pritchard, last seen hiking the Sentinel Range 6 months ago. The photograph showed a man in his 50s, smiling, healthy, wearing expensive hiking gear. Thayer stopped. She studied the poster for several seconds, her expression shifting in a way that was difficult to read, something between recognition and decision. She knew what happened to people who underestimated mountains, who thought preparation was optional, who ignored warnings because they had never faced real consequences. Then she left without another word. 4 nights later, the trail cameras caught something different. The poachers were inside her fenced perimeter, within 200 yards of her cabin. The timestamp showed it was nearly midnight. One man urinated on her porch. Another spray-painted profanity on her shed. The audio picked up their voices clearly. Let us see if the woman comes out. They shined spotlights at her windows, engines revving in the trucks. Deliberate intimidation designed to frighten her into leaving. Make her understand that she was not welcome in her own home. That boundaries meant nothing when you had numbers and distance from law enforcement. The harassment continued for 20 minutes. Inside the dark cabin, Thayer sat motionless. The curtains were closed, but she watched the light sweep across her walls through a narrow gap. She did not move, did not react, just watched with the patience of someone who had spent years in positions where movement meant death. After the trucks finally left, engines roaring in triumph, she stepped outside. The damage was documented methodically, photographs from multiple angles, measurements, notes written in the same careful handwriting that filled all her notebooks. Then she went back inside. This time when she opened the locked case, she removed items with deliberate precision. The tactical vest came out first. Its faded insignia caught the lamplight for just a moment. A seal trident, worn from years of use. Night vision monocular, range-finding binoculars, a handheld GPS unit, a small pack with supplies for 3 days in the field. She laid everything out on the table with the care of someone performing a familiar ritual. The topographic maps were spread across the table. A different notebook emerged, smaller, black, filled with technical calculations, elevation corrections, wind pattern analysis, sightline geometry, range estimations for specific terrain features. She began marking the maps with surgical precision, using a protractor to calculate angles from high points in the mountain, drawing lines of sight, noting distances, planning fields of fire not for shooting, but for observation, for control. On the back page of the black notebook was a phone number, handwritten, a Virginia area code, no name. She stared at it for a long moment. Her hand moved toward the satellite phone in the drawer, then stopped. The memory came unbidden. It always did when she sat in the dark, planning. Syria, 2017. The city of Raqqa during the final push to retake it from ISIS control. She was 37 years old then, still active duty, still believing that missions mattered, that the work made a difference. The safe house was 3 stories, concrete and rebar, windows blown out from previous fighting. 9 hostages held in the basement, aid workers, journalists, a French doctor who had stayed too long trying to help civilians. Intel said they would be executed at dawn. 48 hours to plan, 12 hours to position, 90 seconds to execute. Thayer had been on the rooftop of a bombed-out hospital, 1,300 meters from the target building. Her spotter, Sergeant Dahlia Kincaid, lay beside her. They had worked together for 3 years. Dahlia was 31, sharp as a blade, calm under pressure. She could read wind better than anyone Thayer had ever worked with. 7 guards visible through thermal imaging. 7 targets. 90 seconds before the quick reaction force would respond. After that, the hostages would be killed out of spite. Dahlia's voice in her ear, quiet and steady. Wind at 6 miles per hour northwest. Range, 1,300 meters. First target is stationary on the roof. Second target pacing the north entrance. Clear to engage when ready. Thayer's world had narrowed to the scope. Breathing slowed. Heartbeat visible in the crosshairs as a gentle pulse. She found the space between heartbeats, the place where everything stopped. First shot. The suppressor kept the sound down, but not silent. First target dropped. Second shot. 4 seconds later, second target. Dahlia was already calling corrections for the third. Wind shifted. Adjust 2 clicks right. Third shot. Fourth. Fifth. Sixth. 7th. 90 seconds. 7 targets down. The extraction team moved in. 9 hostages pulled out alive, terrified but breathing. Mission successful. Then the extraction route. The IED was command detonated, hidden in rubble that looked like every other pile of rubble in a city that had been bombed for months. The explosion caught the rear vehicle. Dahlia was in that vehicle. Thayer heard it over the radio. The blast, the screaming, then silence. Dahlia was gone before the medevac arrived. 31 years old, 3 tours, died saving people who would never know her name. Thayer completed the mission, filed the after-action report, attended the memorial service with the rest of the team, received the Navy Cross in a ceremony she did not remember because she was thinking about how Dahlia would have made a joke about the dress uniform, about how uncomfortable it was, about how they should issue medals in comfortable clothing. She left the service 6 months later. Honorable discharge, 12 years of active duty, 23 confirmed kills, operations across 4 countries, a Medal of Honor nomination that got downgraded to a Navy Cross because the operation was classified and the details could not be made public. She bought the most remote property she could find, built a life based on distance and discipline. She had not been hiding. She had been choosing peace. But peace required boundaries, and boundaries only mattered if they were enforced. The photograph on the mantle was of Dahlia, smiling, in desert camouflage, standing in front of a transport vehicle with the sun setting behind her. The photo had been face down since Thayer moved in. Looking at it cost something, a reminder of what she had lost, a reminder of what she had been. Thayer shook herself from the memory and returned to the present, to the maps spread before her, to the decision she had already made. She opened the drawer and removed the satellite phone, powered it on. The screen glowed blue in the darkness. She scrolled to the only saved contact, just a number, no name. Her thumb hovered over the call button for several seconds. Then she pressed it. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered, gruff, careful, alert despite the late hour. The voice of someone who had spent a lifetime taking calls in the middle of the night. Faulkner. Colonel, it is Grace. There was a pause, brief but weighted. Thayer, Grace. Been a long time. You still up on that Montana property? Yes, sir. I have a situation, she explained in precise, clinical terms. The violations, the escalation, the midnight harassment. The complete failure of law enforcement to respond. She did not ask for help. She was asking for something else. Confirmation, assessment, permission from someone who had done similar things in similar circumstances. Faulkner listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of experience earned over decades in places that did not appear on maps. You have Drexel's survey data? The Cold War observation posts? Yes, sir. Found them in the cellar. Sight lines, elevation data, acoustic mapping. Good. Drexel and I planned for this scenario back in '86. Thought the Soviets might try to establish reconnaissance positions in the high country. Never happened, but the defensive positions are sound. You know what you are dealing with? 5 experienced hunters, well-armed, familiar with the terrain, no respect for boundaries or warnings. Faulkner made a sound that might have been a grim laugh. Then you understand, this is not about force, it is about fear. You use that terrain correctly, you will not need to fire a shot. Make them believe something is hunting them. Make them panic. The mountain will do the rest. Thayer said nothing for several seconds. When she spoke, her voice was quiet. Is it defense if they die? If they are on your land after documented warnings and direct threats? If law enforcement refuses to respond? If you never touch them, never fire at them? Faulkner paused. I am not a lawyer, Grace, but I spent 30 years in situations where the law did not reach. What I can tell you is this: boundaries matter, fear is a weapon, and terrain is your greatest advantage. What those men choose to do with their fear is their responsibility, not yours. The call lasted 4 minutes. When Thayer hung up, she deleted the call log immediately, removed the battery, set the phone aside to be disposed of properly. At the bottom of a fresh page in her black notebook, she wrote in careful script, Day 147, all warnings exhausted, proceeding with territorial defense. She set her watch alarm for 4 in the morning. Then she sat in the dark cabin and waited for dawn. When the sun rose, Thayer left the cabin with the rifle slung across her back and the small pack secured. She did not walk toward the road or down the mountain. She walked up, into the densest terrain, following paths that did not exist on any map. Her movements were deliberate, purposeful. This was not hunting. This was positioning. The camera did not follow her into the wilderness. The screen faded to black as she disappeared into the trees, becoming part of the mountain itself. 72 hours later. The radio chatter that emerged 3 days after Thayer disappeared into the mountains was panicked and confused. Different voices, all frightened, crackling through emergency frequencies that search and rescue teams would later recover from abandoned equipment. Breck was not answering his radio. His GPS tracker showed his truck still at the old camp, engine cold, doors hanging open. But he was not there. The camp looked like someone had left in the middle of preparing dinner. Food half cooked over a fire that had burned down to coals. Rifles leaning against trees, safeties still engaged. Cullen had missed his check-in 6 hours ago. His phone went straight to voicemail. His wife called the sheriff's office at dawn, worried because he always called, always checked in, even from the backcountry where signal was unreliable. He would find high ground, get 1 bar, send a text. But this time, nothing. Harlan was not responding either. The last anyone heard from him was a garbled transmission about needing to leave, about something being wrong. Then silence. Someone suggested going up to look for them. Another voice, shakier, said no, something was wrong. They should call the sheriff. The hesitation in that voice suggested they knew on some instinctive level that going up the mountain was a mistake. That whatever had happened to their friends was still up there, waiting. Sheriff Tannick was 55 years old and had seen enough in Cascade County to know when something felt wrong. The radio call came in at 6 in the morning, pulling him from coffee that had gone cold while he reviewed budget reports. Multiple missing persons, all experienced hunters, all last known to be in the same general area of the Bitterroot Range. He drove up the mountain road with Deputy Freeman, passing Thayer Grace's property line marked with those clear, professional signs. The truck was quiet except for the sound of gravel under the tires and the occasional crackle of the radio checking their position with dispatch. Freeman broke the silence first, his voice careful. "How many are we looking for?" "3 confirmed not responding. 2 more have not been seen in 4 days. All hunters with permits for the adjacent national forest." Tannick kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. "They might have crossed onto the Grace property. We know they have been doing it for months." Freeman hesitated before speaking again. "What do you think happened up there?" Tannick did not answer immediately. He was thinking about the folder Thayer had brought in 2 weeks ago. 43 documented violations, names, addresses, license plates, professional documentation that spoke of someone who understood how to build a case, someone who knew procedure. He was also thinking about the background check he had run after she left, the one that hit walls he did not have clearance to get through. Department of Defense employment with details redacted, service record sealed, an address history that jumped from Virginia Beach to San Diego to Dam Neck to locations that were not listed because they were classified. They found the first truck before noon. Breck Holloway's vehicle sat in a small clearing 8 miles from any maintained road, surrounded by pines that blocked the sun and kept the ground in perpetual shadow. The doors hung open like broken wings. Keys were still in the ignition, dangling from a keychain shaped like an elk head. 2 rifles leaned against the hood, unfired, safeties still engaged. A coffee mug rested on the hood, liquid still pooling at the bottom, though it had long since gone cold. There was no blood, no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, just the overwhelming sense of absence, as if the men had been erased mid-action. Tannick walked the perimeter slowly, studying the ground with the practiced eye of someone who had worked crime scenes for 3 decades. Freeman checked the radio inside the truck, still tuned to their frequency. The last transmission was logged 3 days ago. "Going to check the ridgeline, see if we can spot her cabin from up there." Nothing after that. Tannick crouched near the truck, examining boot prints in the soft earth. Multiple sets, all leading away from the vehicle. Not walking, running. The stride length was too long, the depth too deep, heel strikes too pronounced. These men had been sprinting through dense forest, away from something. He looked up at the mountain rising above them. Miles of terrain that could hide anything. Terrain that someone who knew it well could use in ways that people passing through would never imagine. "Get search and rescue up here," he said quietly, "and get me Thayer Grace." The search operation began within hours. Cascade County Search and Rescue mobilized with volunteers from 3 neighboring counties. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging swept grid patterns over 40 square miles of wilderness. Cadaver dogs tracked through dense terrain that fought them at every turn. But before the search fully deployed, Tannick made the drive to Thayer's cabin. 40 minutes on roads that barely deserved the name, climbing elevation until his ears popped and the air thinned. He had called ahead but received no answer, which did not surprise him. When he arrived, Thayer was outside splitting wood with an axe. The rhythm was steady, mechanical, each swing placed precisely, each piece of wood split cleanly. She saw the patrol truck coming and set the axe down, wiping her hands on her jeans. She did not look surprised. She did not look worried. She looked like someone who had been expecting this visit and had prepared accordingly. The cabin was exactly what Tannick expected, and nothing like it at the same time. Sparse, but organized. Clean floors despite the muddy season. No signs of recent activity beyond normal daily living. The rifle above the fireplace was in its case. When he asked to examine it, she handed it over without hesitation. It smelled of oil, but not gunpowder. The barrel was clean, bore lights showing no residue. The action was smooth, well maintained. It had not been fired recently, possibly not for months. Her boots sat by the door, clean and dry. No mud, no debris, no signs of a 3-day excursion into rough country. Everything about the scene suggested a woman who had not left her property in days, who had stayed close to home, doing routine maintenance, living her normal, isolated existence. Tannick explained they were looking for missing hunters, 5 men. Had she seen anyone on her property in the last few days? Thayer walked to her laptop without a word. The screen showed a folder labeled Documentation, Trespass Violations. She clicked through files methodically. Timestamps, GPS coordinates, license plates cross-referenced with vehicle registrations. Everything organized with military precision. She pulled up the harassment footage from 4 nights ago. Tannick leaned forward as the video played. Spotlights sweeping her windows, engines revving, spray paint on the shed. The audio captured every word. "Let us see if the woman comes out." Tannick watched it twice, his jaw tight. She opened a physical folder beside the laptop. Printed photographs going back 4 months. 43 documented violations. Each one cataloged with the care of someone building a legal case or gathering intelligence. Her voice was calm when she spoke. "These men have been trespassing since I bought the property. I documented everything, filed reports. This footage is from 4 nights ago. They came within 200 yards of my cabin, vandalized my property, threatened me. After that, I stayed inside, for my safety." Tannick asked the question that mattered. "You did not see them leave?" Thayer met his eyes directly. "I stay inside when they are on my land, for my safety." It was a perfect answer. Reasonable, defensible, impossible to challenge. Freeman asked what she did after they left. She gestured to the shed visible through the window. "I cleaned the graffiti off, documented the damage, considered filing another report, but I did not think it would matter." The implication was clear without being accusatory. She had done everything legally possible and received no help. She was isolated, alone, facing repeated threats with no support from law enforcement. What else could she have done? Tannick asked if he could look around. Thayer said she would prefer a warrant, but if it would help find the men faster, he was welcome to search. It was exactly the right answer from someone with nothing to hide. They searched for 30 minutes, found nothing suspicious, no hidden gear, no recent mud tracked through the house, no evidence of anyone preparing for or returning from anything in the wilderness. The tactical vest was in its case under the bed, the night vision equipment undisturbed, everything exactly where it should be for someone who owned military surplus equipment but had not used it recently. On the table sat the moleskin notebook, the one with the trespassing documentation. Freeman picked it up with permission and flipped through months of careful logs. The final entry was dated the night of the harassment. Day 147, vandalism occurred, cleaned and documented, law enforcement unable to respond. "You keep detailed records," Tannick said. "It was an observation, not an accusation." Thayer replied without emotion. "When people ignore your boundaries, documentation matters. I learned that in the service." Tannick caught the reference immediately. "You served?" There was a pause, brief but noticeable. She met his eyes. "I did." "What branch?" "Navy." "What did you do in the Navy?" The pause was longer this time. She knew what he was really asking. She knew he was fishing for information he would not find in any public database. Her answer was simple and final. "My job." The silence that followed was heavy. Tannick knew there was more. He knew she was not telling him everything, but he also knew he had nothing to leverage, no evidence to pursue, no legal ground to push harder. He thanked her for her cooperation and told her to call if she saw or heard anything. She said she would. As they walked back to the truck, Freeman spoke quietly. "She did something. I know she did." Tannick opened the driver's door. "Prove it." Freeman started to argue, but Tannick cut him off. "Check what?" 640 acres of wilderness. She has documentation showing months of harassment. She allowed a search without a warrant. We have nothing. The search operation that followed was massive by county standards. Search and rescue teams combed 40 square miles over the next 6 days. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept grid patterns over terrain so rugged that ground teams could barely move through it. Cadaver dogs tracked scents that seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving handlers confused and frustrated. Volunteers from 3 counties joined the effort. Tannock coordinated from a command tent set up at the base of the mountain, maps covered in search grids that grew more complex each day. The families of the missing men called constantly, demanding updates, answers, hope that was becoming harder to provide with each passing hour. They found the second truck on day 2. Same story. Abandoned. Keys inside, no blood, rifles left behind, equipment scattered. The GPS unit showed the last waypoint logged was miles from where the truck sat, as if the driver had become disoriented, turned around, ended up in a location that made no sense. The third truck appeared on day 4, even deeper in the forest, miles from any logical route. It was parked at an angle that suggested panic, desperation, someone fleeing rather than traveling. Inside one truck, they found a journal. The final entry was barely legible, written in handwriting that deteriorated from neat script to something that looked like it was written during an earthquake. Something is out there. We need to leave now. The timestamp on a dropped phone showed the last activity was 3 days ago. A failed call to emergency services. No signal, no connection, just the attempt, logged and abandoned. Search teams reported strange observations that made seasoned rescuers uncomfortable. The dogs would track a scent for miles and then stop, confused, circling the same spot as if the trail simply ended in midair, as if the person had been lifted away by something that left no trace. Operating trackers found boot prints that suggested the men had been running blindly through the forest at night, stumbling over roots, falling down slopes, getting back up and running again. There were signs of falls, broken branches, disturbed ground, blood on rocks where someone had hit their head, but no indication of what they were running from. One team leader radioed back with frustration evident in his voice. "It is like they just vanished. We have equipment. We have tracks showing they were here, but then nothing. Like they ran off the edge of the world." On the 6th day, the search was scaled back. The county could not justify the resources anymore. The state police were asking questions about cost and probability of finding anyone alive. The families were demanding answers no one could provide. Tannock stood in the command tent on day 6, staring at the map. 40 square miles searched, hundreds of man-hours invested, 3 vehicles found, equipment recovered, but no bodies, no blood, no trail that led to anything conclusive. He made the decision to suspend active searching. If anyone stumbled across something, they would respond. But the grid search was over. 3 weeks after the search was suspended, a Forest Service ranger named Yael Ostrander was surveying fire damage in the adjacent national forest. She was 5 miles from Thayer's property line, marking dead trees for removal, when her dog started barking at a ravine. The animal was trained for search work, disciplined, not given to false alerts. Yael climbed down carefully, using roots and rocks for handholds. The ravine was steep, choked with deadfall and thick underbrush. She found a boot first, still laced, separated from its owner. Then a backpack, contents scattered by animals. Then something that made her reach for her radio with shaking hands. The crime scene was processed by state police. 4 bodies scattered across 3 miles of terrain, all in the same general drainage. The medical examiner arrived by helicopter. Initial assessment took 6 hours. Detective Sears was 50 years old, a state investigator who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing until now. He walked Tannock through the preliminary findings. 4 bodies, been here at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. Primary cause of death appears to be exposure, hypothermia, but there are complications. What kind of complications? Tannock asked, though he suspected he already knew. Sears pulled out a tablet showing the body locations marked on a topographic map. They died close together in time, within hours of each other based on decomposition rates, but in different locations spanning 3 miles. That is unusual for exposure deaths. Usually people die where they stop moving. These men were still moving when they died. Tannick studied the map. All 4 locations showed the men had been moving away from Thayer's property line. Fast, running, fleeing. The terrain they had covered in their final hours was brutal. Steep slopes, dense forest, terrain that would be dangerous even in daylight. At night, it would be nearly impossible. Sears pointed to the injury reports: fractured ankles, broken fingers from falls, deep lacerations from running through dense brush at speed. These men were not hiking. They were fleeing, running like something was chasing them. "What about cause of death?" Tannick asked, though he knew the answer would not satisfy anyone. Sears shook his head. "That is the strange part. No gunshot wounds, no blunt force trauma, no stab wounds, no obvious signs of foul play. Toxicology will take weeks, but preliminary examination shows elevated cortisol and adrenaline. These men were terrified when they died. They ran themselves to exhaustion in the dark, fell repeatedly, kept getting up and running until their bodies gave out." Tannick looked at the terrain: steep, unforgiving, dangerous at night. But these were experienced outdoorsmen, men who knew how to survive in the wilderness. Sears agreed. "That is what makes this unusual. These were not panic tourists. These were professionals who knew how to handle themselves in backcountry. What would make men like this run like that? What about the 5th man? Harlan Vickers is still missing." Sears looked at the map, at the pattern of where the bodies were found. If he followed the same pattern, he could be anywhere within a 10-mile radius, or he could have gone the other direction entirely. "We will keep looking, but given the terrain and the time elapsed, the chances of finding him alive are 0. That night, Tannick sat alone in his office, unable to let it go. He pulled Thayer's initial police report, overlaid it with the missing persons files, studied the map showing where the bodies were found. All 4 had been on national forest land when they died, but the terrain analysis suggested they had entered from Thayer's property and were moving away from it when they succumbed. He opened his laptop and ran a deeper background check on Thayer Grace. Previous address in Virginia Beach. Employment history listed as Department of Defense with details redacted. That was significant. DOD did not redact details for administrative positions. He searched deeper, looking for anything that might explain who she really was. He found a news article from 2017. Local Navy SEAL honored for service in anti-terror operations. No photograph, no name, details classified. But the date and location matched Thayer's service timeline. He found another article from 2018. Navy to review rules of engagement after controversial operation. SEAL team member cleared of wrongdoing. Again, names redacted. Again, the dates aligned with her discharge. He tried accessing military service records and hit a wall. Classified, sealed, unavailable to local law enforcement without federal clearance he did not have. But he found one thing buried in a congressional database: a Medal of Honor nomination that had been downgraded to a Navy Cross. The recipient was listed only as Chief Petty Officer T.A. Grace. The citation was completely redacted. Whatever she had done was so classified that even the description of her actions was considered a security risk. Tannick sat back in his chair and stared at the screen. He understood now. Thayer Grace was not just a veteran. She was a ghost. Someone who had operated at levels most people did not know existed. Someone trained to eliminate threats with precision and disappear without trace. Someone who understood terrain and psychology and fear in ways that could turn a mountain into a weapon. He looked at the map again, the pattern of where the bodies were found, the way the men had died, running in terror from something they never escaped. He knew what had happened. But knowing was not the same as proving. The next morning, he drove back to Thayer's property alone. No deputy, no backup. This was not an official visit. He found her chopping wood again, the same steady rhythm, the same precise movements. She saw him coming and set the axe down. They sat on her porch without speaking for a long moment. Finally, Tannick broke the silence. "We found them. 4 bodies. National Forest, 5 miles from your boundary. Medical examiner says exposure. Hypothermia. They got disoriented, separated, panicked." Thayer said she had heard the helicopters. Her voice carried no emotion, no relief, no concern, just acknowledgement. Tannick continued, "That terrain they were in, it is brutal. Easy to get turned around in the dark, especially if something spooked them." He paused. "You would know about that terrain. You walk your property every morning. You know every ridge, every valley." Thayer replied quietly, "I know my property, not the National Forest." Tannick pulled out a folder. He had spent the night preparing this conversation. "I did some reading. Navy Cross, SEAL Team Operations, Syria, 2017, 9 hostages rescued, 7 targets eliminated. The citation is mostly redacted, but what remains tells a story. Someone with skills most people cannot imagine." Thayer did not react, did not confirm or deny, just waited. "There was an operation, classified, Raqqa extraction. You were the primary shooter, 7 targets in 90 seconds, through a sandstorm, from positions that required you to move 3 times without being detected." Tannick leaned forward. "You know what I think happened up here? I think those men came onto your land, harassed you, threatened you, and I think when the law could not protect you, you protected yourself. Not with violence, with fear. You made 5 experienced hunters believe something was hunting them." The silence stretched between them. Wind moved through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. Finally, Thayer spoke. "Is there a question, Sheriff? Did you kill those men?" She met his eyes without hesitation. "No, I did not kill those men." It was not a lie. Technically, it was completely accurate. "Did you do anything that resulted in their deaths?" Her answer was measured, precise, legally perfect. "I defended my property within the law. I never fired a weapon at another person. I never laid a hand on anyone. What happened to them happened on federal land, miles from my boundary. They chose to run. They chose to panic. I cannot control what people do when they realize they have made a terrible mistake." Tannick stood, picked up his folder. For what it is worth, those men had records. Breck Holloway had 3 domestic violence arrests. Cullen Mays was under investigation for illegal game trafficking. They were not good people. "But they were people," Thayer replied quietly. Tannick walked toward his truck and stopped halfway. "One more thing. That Medal of Honor that got downgraded. I read between the lines. 7 targets in 90 seconds. You saved 9 people that day, and the country could not even thank you publicly. So I will. Thank you for your service, Chief Petty Officer Grace." She nodded once. Tannick got in his truck. Before closing the door, he added one final thing. "If there are any records, any logs, any evidence of communication, now would be a good time to make sure there are not." Their eyes met. She understood. Already taken care of. He drove away. After his truck disappeared down the mountain, Thayer walked into her cabin. She opened the drawer with the satellite phone. One outgoing call in the log. 4 days ago. Duration, 4 minutes. A saved contact, just a number, no name. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she deleted the call log, removed the SIM card, removed the battery. She walked outside with the pieces, used a rock to smash the SIM into fragments too small to recover data from, buried them separately in her garden, spacing them 20 feet apart beneath where tomatoes would grow in spring. 6 weeks later, Harlan Vickers' body was found 18 miles away, across the state line in Montana. The report came through official channels. Bear attack, partially consumed. The injuries were consistent with running through dense forest at night. Multiple fractures, deep lacerations from falls, signs of severe hypothermia before the bear found him. The medical examiner noted defensive wounds were minimal. The victim may have already been unconscious when the animal encountered him, dead or dying when nature finished what terror had started. The official conclusion was added to the case file. 5 experienced hunters entered unfamiliar terrain at night, became separated, panicked, succumbed to elements. Tragic accident. Case closed. But in the bars and hunting lodges, in the places where men gathered to tell stories, a different narrative emerged. One that would be told for years. About 5 men who crossed a fence, who ignored warnings, who threatened a woman they thought was helpless, and about what happened when that woman used skills the government had spent millions teaching her to turn 72 hours into a nightmare that ended in death without a single shot fired. The newspaper headline ran in the County Gazette 6 weeks after the last body was found. Poachers die in mountain wilderness. Exposure deaths ruled accidental. The article was brief, clinical, focused on facts that raised no questions. 5 men entered unfamiliar terrain. Weather conditions deteriorated. Communication failed. Search and rescue efforts were extensive, but ultimately recovery became retrieval. The county coroner expressed condolences to the families. The sheriff's office declined further comment. The case was closed with the bureaucratic finality of paperwork filed and forgotten. But in the bars and diners of the valley, in the hunting camps and Forest Service stations, a different story circulated. It moved through conversations in hushed tones, shared over coffee and knowing glances, passed between people who spent their lives in these mountains and understood what could not be said in official reports. 5 men went onto that woman's land, professionals who had been hunting those mountains for 15 years. They ignored the signs, laughed at the warnings. 3 days later, they were running through the forest in the dark, terrified of something nobody could name. 4 died of exposure. The 5th was found 18 miles away, partially eaten by a bear after hypothermia had already taken him. The question nobody asked officially, but everyone considered privately, was simple. What had they been running from? The medical examiner's report mentioned elevated cortisol and adrenaline, physiological markers of extreme fear. These were not men who had gotten lost and calmly succumbed to the cold. These were men who had been hunted by something that never touched them, but drove them to exhaustion and death through sheer terror. The details leaked slowly through the community. Boot prints showing they had been running, not walking. Equipment abandoned in places that made no sense. One man's journal with a final entry that simply read, "Something is out there," written in handwriting that deteriorated from neat script to barely legible scrawl across 3 words. The Forest Service quietly updated their maps, marking Thayer's property with notations that suggested caution. The hunting forums online filled with speculation and warnings. Whatever you do, do not cross that fence line. The woman up there is not what she seems. Detective Sears from the state police spent 3 additional weeks trying to find something actionable. He interviewed everyone who had known the deceased men. He reviewed every piece of evidence collected from the scene. He studied Thayer's background as much as classified restrictions would allow. He found nothing that would hold up in court. No weapon discharged, no physical contact, no threats made. Just a woman who had documented months of harassment, filed official complaints, and then remained on her property while 5 men entered her land and died on federal territory miles away. His final report concluded with the same determination: accidental death by exposure, no evidence of criminal activity, case closed. But Sears added a note to the file that would never be included in official records. A personal observation meant for anyone who might look at this case years later and wonder what really happened. In my professional opinion, these men encountered something on or near the Grace property that induced extreme psychological distress. Whether that something was natural predator, environmental hazard, or human intervention cannot be determined from available evidence. What is certain is that experienced outdoorsmen with decades of combined wilderness experience exhibited panic behavior inconsistent with their training and background. The note was filed separately, marked for internal review only, and eventually buried in archives where it would gather dust alongside thousands of other cases that defied easy explanation. Spring came to the Bitterroot Range with the slow transformation that high elevations demand. Snow receded from the lower meadows first, revealing grass that had been dormant for months. Wildflowers emerged in patches of purple and yellow. Deer returned to graze in the open areas, wary but persistent. Thayer walked her property line as she always had, checking each post, each sign, documenting everything in her weathered notebook. But something had changed in a way that was immediately visible to anyone who understood the patterns of these mountains. The boot prints that used to cross her boundary were gone. The trail camera footage showed hunters approaching the fence line, reading the signs, and turning back without argument. Some took photographs of the warnings as if documenting evidence of their compliance. Others made wide circles around her property, adding miles to their routes rather than risk even accidental trespass. The game trails that crossed her lands showed increased animal activity. Elk that had avoided the area for years returned to their traditional migration routes. The wolves that had been displaced by human presence reclaimed territory they had abandoned. The mountain was healing in ways that statistical analysis could measure, but struggled to explain. She stopped at a section of fence where someone had added an unofficial warning. The spray paint was crude, but the message was clear. Turn back, private land. She means it. Below it, in different handwriting, someone had added, 5 men did not listen, 5 men died. Thayer studied the additions for a long moment. She did not remove them, did not paint over them. They served a purpose she had not intended, but would not discourage. The fence posts stood straight. The signs remained intact. Not a single one had been damaged in 6 months. The mountain had learned something that could not be taught through law or logic. Boundaries were real when enforced by someone willing to make them real. The local bar, 6 months after the incident, was busy on a Friday night. Hunters preparing for the fall season gathered to share plans and check regulations. The walls were covered with decades of photographs showing successful hunts, trophy animals, groups of men proud of their skills and their harvests. But among the newer photos, there was a noticeable gap. Nobody was posting pictures from the Morrison sector anymore. The conversation around the old wooden tables was animated, covering weather patterns and game movement and equipment recommendations. But when someone mentioned Sector 7, the area that included Thayer's property, the conversation quieted. 2 men sat at the far end of the bar, studying a map spread across the scarred wooden table. The younger one, maybe 25, with the confidence of someone who had grown up hunting but had not yet learned the mountain's harder lessons, traced a route with his finger that cut close to Thayer's property line. The older hunter, weathered and careful with the scars of 3 decades in these mountains, visible on his hands and face, grabbed his wrist hard enough to stop the motion. "Do not," the younger man protested. "It is just adjacent. We would not even be on her land. We would stay on the National Forest side. It is legal." The older man shook his head firmly. "You do not know the story." "What story?" "Everyone keeps talking about that woman like she is some kind of monster. She is just a person. She has property. We would not trespass. What is the problem?" The older man took a long drink from his beer before answering. 5 men went up there 18 months ago, best hunters in the county. Breck Holloway had been guiding for 20 years. Harlan Vickers could track anything that moved. They were professionals who had been crossing that land for years, long before she bought it. He continued, his voice dropping. They thought some woman living alone could not do anything about them trespassing. She filed complaints. Nothing happened. They kept coming back, got bolder. Then one night they went up to her cabin, vandalized it, threatened her directly. 3 days after that, all 5 of them disappeared. Their trucks were found abandoned, equipment left behind. Eventually, they found 4 of them scattered across 3 miles of national forest, all dead, all showing signs of running through dense brush in the dark. The medical examiner said they died of exposure, so they got lost, had an accident. Why is everyone treating it like she did something? The older man leaned in closer. Because these were not men who got lost. They knew these mountains, but something made them run. Something scared them so badly that they abandoned their vehicles, their weapons, their supplies, and fled into the forest in the middle of the night. They ran until they could not run anymore, until their bodies gave out. And the thing they were running from never fired a shot, never touched them, left no tracks, nothing the sheriff could investigate. The younger hunter asked quietly, "What was she?" Former military, special operations, Navy SEAL, the kind of person who spent 12 years learning how to eliminate threats without leaving evidence. She left the service and bought the most remote property she could find because she wanted to be left alone. He pointed to a different route on the map, one that swung wide around Thayer's property. "This is where we hunt now, because that woman up there drew a line and made it clear what happens when you cross it, not through courts or lawyers, but through consequences that are final and absolute." The younger hunter stared at the map. "You really think she killed them?" The older man refolded the map. "I think she did not have to kill them. I think she made them kill themselves through panic and fear, and that is somehow more terrifying." They packed up and left. As they did, the older man added one final thing. "Some lessons you learn from other people's mistakes." Those 5 men learned that boundaries matter, that warnings are not suggestions, that a woman alone is not the same as a woman helpless. We get to learn that lesson without paying the price they paid. The Forest Service office showed the statistical change most clearly. Ranger Yael Ostrander stood before a map marking poaching incidents across the district. The data covered 10 years, color-coded by severity and frequency. Every sector showed consistent activity except one. Sector 7, which included Thayer's property and the surrounding national forest, had shown regular violations for 9 years. Red marks clustered thick across the map. Then 18 months ago, the marks stopped. Not gradually, they simply ceased. The sector went from one of the highest violation areas to 0 incidents in the span of a single season. Another ranger asked what changed. Yael pointed to a single date on the graph. "That is when Thayer Grace bought the Morrison property." Someone asked if they thought she was responsible for the drop in poaching. Yael chose her words carefully. "I think boundaries started mattering in that sector. I think people realized there were consequences. Whatever the reason, we have our first 0 poaching year in that sector in over a decade. And from a conservation perspective, that is unequivocally positive." She pulled up additional data. Wildlife populations in Sector 7 have increased measurably. Elk herds are using traditional migration routes they had abandoned. Wolf packs have reestablished territories. Even bird populations and plant diversity show improvement. Whatever is happening on that property, it is creating a refuge effect. The federal land adjacent to her property is seeing benefits because the pressure has been removed. The district supervisor studied the data. His response was pragmatic. "Whatever is working, we do not interfere. If that sector maintains 0 violations, we reallocate enforcement resources to areas with active problems. If Miss Grace's presence is deterring illegal activity, that serves our mission. We do not ask questions we do not want answered." Sheriff Tannock sat in his office on a cold afternoon in late autumn, filing away the last documents related to the case. The folder was thick with reports, search records, medical examiner findings, witness statements that said everything and nothing. He placed it in a filing cabinet and locked it. Deputy Freeman entered without knocking. "We ever going back up there?" "Only if she calls us, which she will not need to." Freeman leaned against the doorframe. You really think she did what everyone says? Tannock considered the question. I think 5 men ignored clearly posted warnings on isolated private property. I think they harassed and threatened a woman who had every legal right to defend herself. I think they entered terrain they thought they understood and encountered something they were completely unprepared for. He walked to the window. I believe that woman earned a Navy Cross for actions so classified the citation itself is redacted. I believe she was part of operations that required precision and ruthlessness in equal measure. I believe she left that life and bought the most remote property she could find because she wanted peace. And I believe when men violated that peace repeatedly and threatened her in her own home, she made a decision. She chose to defend her boundaries using the skills she possessed. Whether that defense was active or passive, the result was the same. 5 men entered her property after months of warnings. 3 days later, they were dead. Not from bullets, but from fear that drove them to run until their bodies failed. Freeman absorbed this quietly. So we just let it go. What would you have me do? Arrest her for what? The medical examiner found no evidence of foul play. They died of exposure on federal land. Every piece of evidence supports accidental death. The only thing that suggests otherwise is circumstantial timing. None of that would survive trial. He pulled out another folder. Look at who those men were. Breck Holloway had 3 domestic violence arrests, beat his wife badly enough to put her in the hospital twice. Cullen Mays was under investigation for running an illegal game meat operation. Harlan Vickers did 2 years for aggravated assault. These were not innocent victims. Freeman looked at the folder. So they deserved what they got. I am not making that judgment. I am saying that when predators encounter something higher on the food chain, the outcome is predictable. Those men spent years violating boundaries because there were never consequences. They learned that the law could not reach them. Then they encountered someone who did not need the law, someone who could enforce boundaries directly. And they learned too late that some people are not helpless just because they are alone. What if she does it again? Then they will have ignored signs, warnings, and the well-known story of what happened to the last people who made that choice. At that point, it is not a failure of law enforcement, it is natural selection. Winter settled in early. The first significant snow fell in mid-October, blanketing the peaks and making the access roads treacherous. By November, Thayer's cabin was accessible only by snowmobile or on foot. The isolation she had sought became absolute. No casual visitors, no unexpected guests, just the mountain, the snow, and the silence. She stood on her porch one afternoon as the latest storm moved in, coffee steaming in her hands. The weather forecast called for 18 inches. This storm would close the road completely for at least a week. She had supplies for 3 months. The generator was serviced. The firewood was stacked. She was prepared for isolation in a way most people could not imagine. A vehicle approached, struggling through snow. She recognized it before it reached the clearing. Sheriff Tannock, alone, driving a heavy truck with chains on all 4 tires. The only person who had visited her property since the incident. The only person who knew what she had done, or suspected strongly enough that it amounted to knowing, and had chosen to look the other way. She waited as he parked and made his way up the steps, carrying a small box. He did not speak immediately, just handed her the box. Inside was her Navy Cross, properly mounted and framed, with the official citation visible beneath the metal. For extraordinary heroism in combat operations, for actions under fire that resulted in the successful extraction of 9 civilian hostages, for demonstrated valor in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. She had earned this through blood and skill, and a willingness to do what others could not. How did you manage this? Thayer asked quietly. I know some people, made some calls. Your record was sealed for operational security, but enough time has passed. The Navy keeps track of its decorated personnel. They were willing to release this for display with appropriate redactions. I figured you should have it, not hidden away, but here where you can see it. Thayer looked at the medal without removing it from the case. It represented a day in the desert when she had taken 7 shots and saved 9 lives and lost the woman who had been her spotter and closest friend. It represented years of service that had cost her more than anyone who had not lived it could understand. "I did not want recognition," she said. "I know, but you earned it. And more importantly, you earned the right to choose what to do with it. Display it, hide it, burn it. That is your choice, but you should have it." He reached into his jacket and pulled out another envelope. This one was different, personal. The paper was thin, expensive, no official letterhead, just a handwritten address in Virginia. Thayer opened it carefully. Inside was a single card. The handwriting was precise, masculine, efficient. She recognized it immediately, though she had not seen it in years. Boundaries held. Mission successful. Drexel would be proud. F. That was all. No signature beyond the initial. But she knew. The number she had called from the satellite phone. The 4-minute conversation in the dark before she went into the mountains. Not for backup, not for help, for confirmation. For the tactical assessment she needed from someone who understood what she was about to do. Colonel Faulkner, Drexel's old partner from Cold War operations. The man who had helped Drexel map those sight lines decades ago. The man who had told her, during that 4-minute call, that the terrain would do the work if she positioned correctly. That fear was more effective than force. That she would not need to fire a shot. She had called him not because she did not know what to do, but because she needed to hear from someone who had done similar things in similar circumstances, that what she was about to do was not murder. It was defense, and there was a difference. Thayer folded the card and placed it in the fire. Watched the paper curl and blacken. The edges caught flame and the words disappeared into ash. No evidence, no connection. Tannick watched the card burn without comment. Then he handed her a third envelope. This one was from the County Fish and Wildlife Commission. The letter was formal, typed on official letterhead, signed by 3 commissioners. It thanked her for her cooperation in reducing poaching activity in Sector 7. 18 months without a single incident. First time in over a decade. The wildlife population recovery was measurable and significant. They wanted to formally acknowledge her contribution to conservation efforts in the region. She read the letter twice. "They are thanking me for buying land." Tannick leaned against the porch rail. "They are thanking you for making it clear that boundaries matter, that some lines are not suggestions, that there are consequences for people who think isolation means vulnerability. They cannot say that directly, cannot acknowledge what everyone knows happened, but they understand that your presence has changed the dynamic in this region. Poaching has stopped. Wildlife is recovering. The forest is healthier. However that outcome was achieved, they recognize its value." Thayer set the letter down. The consequences were theirs to choose. "I posted signs, filed reports, documented months of harassment. They decided warnings did not apply to them. That a woman alone could not enforce boundaries. They were wrong. And now your fence line is treated like it is electrified. Nobody approaches it without explicit permission. Nobody questions it. Nobody crosses it. I have not received a single trespassing complaint from this area in 18 months. That is unprecedented." He turned to leave, then stopped. Those men who died. Official record says accident, exposure, poor decisions in bad conditions. That is how it will stay in every file, every report, every official document. But I wanted you to know that nobody else is going to make their mistakes. Word is out. Your land is sacred ground now. Not because of what anyone knows for certain, but because of what everyone suspects. And sometimes suspicion is more effective than proof. What do people suspect? They suspect that you are exactly what your service record suggests. A person trained to eliminate threats with precision and without trace. A person who understands how to use terrain and psychology and fear as weapons more effective than bullets. They suspect that 5 men crossed your fence, and you made them believe they were being hunted until terror drove them to death without you ever firing a shot. And whether that suspicion is accurate or not, it serves the same purpose. It keeps people away. He descended the steps. Before getting in his truck, he looked back one final time. "Thank you for your service, Chief Petty Officer Grace." Both times. The first time when you wore the uniform and saved lives under fire, and the second time when you drew a line here and made it mean something. This mountain is better for your presence. This county is better. And those of us who understand what really happened are grateful, even if we can never say so officially. She nodded once. He drove away, tire tracks filling with fresh snow behind him almost immediately. Within an hour, they would be completely covered, as if he had never been there at all. Thayer watched until the truck disappeared, then went inside. The cabin was warm, the fire burning steady, lamplight casting yellow glow across familiar spaces. She placed the Navy cross on the mantel with deliberate care. Beside it sat the photograph that had been face down for so long. She picked it up and studied it. Dahlia smiled from the frame, frozen in that moment of youth and confidence and the camaraderie that came from shared danger. Thayer raised her coffee cup in silent salute. To the dead who had earned rest, to the living who had learned boundaries, to the mountain that kept its secrets, and to peace, however it was won. The final light faded outside. Stars emerged in the clear, cold sky. Thayer sat by the fire with Dahlia's photograph visible on the mantel beside her Navy cross. 2 reminders of who she had been. 2 acknowledgments that the past deserved recognition, even when it carried weight. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The mountains settled into winter silence. And the boundaries that had been tested and proven held firm, marked by signs that everyone now understood meant exactly what they said. Some lessons are written in textbooks. Others are written in mountains. Thayer had learned both. Now these boundaries taught everyone else. Respect them, honor them, cross them at your own risk. Because choices, especially those made in defiance of clear warnings, carry consequences that cannot be avoided or appealed. The fence stood straight in the darkness. The signs remained clear even under snow. And the woman who had drawn these lines walked her property each morning, documenting and maintaining and defending the peace she had earned through service and sacrifice, and the unwavering enforcement of boundaries that others had tried and failed to erase. The Morrison sector remained quiet, 0 violations. The wildlife thrived, and Thayer Grace lived alone on her mountain, finally granted the peace she had sought when she left the service and bought 640 acres of wilderness where she could be forgotten. She had not been forgotten. She had become legend, a story told in bars and hunting camps, a warning passed between guides and their clients, a lesson learned by everyone except the 5 men who had needed it most. And on cold winter nights, when the wind moved through the pines and the snow fell silent, the mountain remembered what had happened there. The boundaries that had been tested, the warnings that had been ignored, and the woman who had proven that peace has a price. She had been willing to pay it, and now everyone else was too.